slide number 4, which just talks to the changes to the fiscal framework. If we look at the equitable share, it makes up 80.7% of the provincial budget. Conditional grants, 16.6%, leaving 2.7% from our provincial own revenue sources. If we look at where the changes have come in, the equitable share has increased by 1.7 billion rand in the first year, growing up to 2.3 and then 3.1 over the MTF. And these funds are allocated for the following reasons. The first one is the equitable share formula was updated, and for the first time in a while, it's actually worked in our favor, and that resulted in a 555 million rand increase in the first year, growing to 1.4 up to 2.1 billion rand. This is a policy decision that where changes in equitable share, they are spread over a 3-year period. The next is funds that were given to the Department of Education in terms of Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, and this amounts to 260 million rand, and it's only 1-year allocation. Then we have funds from National Treasury in terms of the wage agreement. So when we are budgeting as departments, we were asked to budget 4.6%, but the final wage agreement that was settled was 5.5%. We were therefore given the gap funding as was agreed at the Budget Council, and we received 918 million rand in the first year, and it increases to 989 to 1 billion over the MTF. We then look at the next slide, just gives those same figures, but in the fiscal framework document, you can see the first allocation, the 555 million rand, which then increases the equitable share to 126. We then got additional adjustments, as I've mentioned, 918 and 260 million rand. That gives us a total allocation in terms of equitable share of 128 billion rand for the next year. If we then look at additional funds for the equitable share, obviously we are very appreciative of the fact that we've been given additional funding, but we then had to look at how we were going to allocate that additional money that came to the province, given that there were significant budget pressures. There was also as we said, the presidential funds were allocated to education. This is a specific allocation. And then in terms of the wage agreement gap, it was determined by the executive that these funds should go to the social sector departments, given the spending pressures that they have, and the small balance that was there was kept in the contingency reserve. What we will do as Treasury, we will do a mid-year assessment, and should any of the other departments be facing any pressures due to the wage increase, we will make those allocations during the adjustment estimates subject to the executive's approval. So then in the next slide, we'll then look at the conditional grants. Very positively, we've increased in terms of the conditional grants, 1.3 billion in the first year, 79 in the second year, 1.2 in the outer year. In the main, these go to education, health and transport, where you can see the infrastructure grant for education increased by 93 million, health, revitalization, 76 million, and transport road maintenance grant, 874 million. In the next slide, as we said, a number of the grants have received increases. This is in particular where there's a wage bill element in the conditional grant, and because of that differential between what was budgeted and what was settled on, additional funds were made to top up those grants. So we have the CASP grant, the Letseme project grant, EPWP, and we've listed all the grants that are there that received that slight adjustment. The one grant that we have seen a net reduction is the CASP grant at agriculture, and in the main this is because funds were taken back to national in terms of the blended finance scheme that's taking place at a national level. Similarly, we've seen a change in some of the conditional grants where the review was undertaken by National Treasury. Here you will see the social sector EPWP incentive grant and the EPWP integrated grant now being combined into one grant in the MTF going forward. If we move on to provincial own revenue, as the MEC indicated, unfortunately there's been a net reduction in own revenue. The two main contributors to that is Department of Health in terms of patient fees. You'll see the reductions in terms of what was submitted in the original baseline and what was submitted in the third budget submissions. The other contributor is Provincial Treasury in terms of the interest. Obviously, the amount of revenue or cash that's available to be invested is declining, as well as the interest rate, as you would know, has also declined, and we've then projected for that over the MTF. So in terms of that, obviously the positive increases in revenue is Department of Transport, and mainly this is because of the abnormal load permits, in that the mass port loads and the mandatory requirement for all of these coming out the Durban Harbour obviously results in further revenue for the province. We've also seen an increase in the fines, which is aligned to the historic collection trends. So the way we dealt with this decline in revenue, one, we reduced the offset against the additional equitable share, and the other is we reduced the contingency reserve. In the next slide, which is slide 15, you would then see the provincial-owned revenue and the contributions from each of the provincial departments. And in total, you will then see a 4.2 billion rand is what we project in the next financial year to collect as a province. The legislature does also generate their own revenue, 1.2 million, but that does not come into the revenue fund. Then in terms of provincial owned receipts, this slide then gives a breakdown in terms of the source of own revenue. You would see there you have quite significant tax receipts, which is your casino taxes, 637 million, horse racing taxes, 117 million, liquor licenses, 34 million, motor vehicle licensing is the bulk, 2.3 billion rand. We also then have sales of goods and services, 539 million, fines, penalties and forfeits, 173 million, interest, which is on the surplus funds, 342 million, sale of capital assets, 16 million, and transactions in financial assets, 77 million. So those are the sources of our own revenue in the province. If we then move on to slide 18, again, this then is a summary of our fiscal framework, what makes up the budget. Again, you will see here that provincial equitable share is 128 billion rand, conditional grants 26 billion, our own revenue that I've just taken you through, 4.2 billion, provincial cash resources, it's 2.5 million, giving us a total of 158 billion rand. You will also see that the contingency reserve is at 278 million for the first year, growing over the MTF. As the MEC indicated, we need that contingency reserve to deal with any unforeseen expenditure during the year, going to 356 million up to 468 million in the 27-28 year. If we then move to slide 20, we're then referring to the allocation of the additional equitable share. As we indicated, it came from various sources. So the first allocation was made to vote 2, which is the provincial legislature, of 40 million rand, and this is in the main for your wage agreement, which was higher than what was budgeted for, your researchers, voter education, and oversight committees. Vote 3 received 60 million rand, growing over the MTF with a slight decline in 27-28, and this is really to deal with the communal livestock production, foot and mouth disease, and laboratory equipment. Then we moved to vote 5. So there were 3 new allocations. One is that wage agreement gap of 497 million rand, as well as the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, 260 million, and then the budget pressures, which was that additional equitable share from national, 64 million went to education. Health receives 2 allocations. One is the wage agreement gap of 334 million, and then also out of the equitable share adjustments, we gave them an additional 62 million rand. Community Safety and Liaison receives 21 million rand, and this specifically to a number of areas around law graduates, complaint system, and gender-based violence activists. The next one is transport, learner transport. As we know, there's significant spending pressures in learner transport, so they were given an additional allocation from the equitable share adjustment of 50 million rand, growing over the MTF. Social development also facing spending pressures on the wage agreement, so there was a gap that we funded 17 million rand, and then the additional budget pressures that they had, we allocated an additional 14 million rand, which should assist social development in their spending pressures. The last allocation was made to public works. As honourable members would know, the baseline for the public property rates is inadequate. We were able to allocate 168 million rand, growing significantly over the MTF, but unfortunately it still is not adequate for both property rates and scholar transport. It will have to be addressed during the year. Slide 21, changes to conditional grant allocations. As we said earlier, in the main we've seen an increase over the MTF, and we have given significant detail in Chapter 4 of of one of the green books that we handed out, the EPRE. It will be shown in there. As we indicated, there's also inflationary increases to conditional grants, and also the top-up for the wage agreement that was negotiated at higher than what was budgeted. So if we look at those, in aggregate, 147 million rand was received for the EPWP integrated grant. and that's an increase from the 141 million rand we received last year. The education infrastructure grant, I have mentioned that it's a 93 million rand increase, in the main because of the way that they are reporting on their expenditure and the capacity to spend. So that's a very positive 84% score, and we received 93 million as a result. The NSNP, we've also received an additional amount, which is very welcome, 33.3 million rand, which then the budget becomes 2.3 billion rand. As members would know, there were spending pressures in NSNP, so this increase is welcomed. The Early Child Development Grant also received 17.4 million, which then increases the budget for this grant to 308 million rand over the MTA. Other significant changes, the health facility revitalization, also again because the department reported correctly on this, and also the capacity to spend, scored 95%, resulting in an additional 76 million rand. The district health program grant increases by 34.6 billion, which increases then the total baseline to 7.5 billion rand. Provincial road maintenance grant is also an incentive-based grant and has seen a significant increase of 874 million in the next year, giving the budget of 3.5 billion rand. So after all these amendments, on slide 25, we then give an indication of each budget per vote, adding up to the 158 billion rand. We also indicate in the outer column the percentage that each department represents the total budget. So the largest contribution is education, receiving 42% of the budget. Health receives 35% of the budget, and transport the third largest at 8.7% of the budget. We then, on the next slide, again just give an indication of where the funding is going per sector. As we would understand it, the social sector receives a significant portion, 79.9% of the budget, with the balance of 20.2% going to all other departments, so protecting the frontline service delivery departments. The next slide, slide 27, is around infrastructure. And here again, you would see in the main, a significant portion of the infrastructure budget goes to existing infrastructure. And you'd also see that the economic infrastructure is receiving the majority of this share, which is critical for the economic growth in the province. So they're receiving 68.6% of all the infrastructure. You will see on slide 27 the exact breakdown in terms of where that funding will go for infrastructure. You will note that existing infrastructure receives 10.1 billion rand. So this is maintaining or upgrading or refurbishing of that existing infrastructure. We have new infrastructure of 1.3 billion rand. We have infrastructure transfers of 3 billion rand. We also have infrastructure leases, 525 million, and non-infrastructure of 3.3, giving us the total of 18.2 billion rand infrastructure spend. I'm then going to move on to the conclusion, Chair. There obviously is a significant increase in the budget for the 25-26 MTF. It does not compensate for the historic fiscal consolidation that we've seen in the last few years. So those are still within the baselines of those departments. There were requests from departments of 12.6 billion rand. And obviously, given the amount that we received from National in the current year of 555 million, it was impossible to meet those needs. The baselines, as I indicated, for scholar transport and municipal property rates have still not been corrected, but obviously this would have to be considered during the adjustments at mid-year. So there will be continued pressure on these two items. We continue to state that the province must manage their fiscus very tightly and ensure that funds are only spent on essential goods and services. Thank you, Chair.
Shoti, thank you so much for that. There's the briefing, honorable members. Of course, we're still going to have the budget hearings to all departments where you serve. So you'll have enough time to interrogate the budget. This is just an overall briefing by the provincial treasury, but we're still going to sit, and have a hearing where, of course, the department would also be present in detailing each and every departmental budget. So we'll still have enough time that is going to be allocated. But of course, we can give you any clarity-seeking questions or any comments that you might feel you you have on the presentation that we have received. But of course, there's still a lot of time to interrogate and get into details of this budget, as I've mentioned earlier. But I will not close for any member who would want to have a bite just now. Any member, I will take it that there is no, at this point in time, there is no comment. Okay. No, thank you so much. Then we will then adjourn the session, this briefing. Thank you so much for being a good audience. Thank you. Sorry. I'm being advised here that your green book is your main document. So it's advisable that you do not lose it, because that's where all of the details per department is contained regarding the budget. So we are requesting you to really keep them, and when you are coming for hearing, bring your copy. Please don't lose them. We know honorable members have got offices are in and around. It's easy if there is around rather than leaving it at home, if you feel that is a safer way. Thank you so much, honorable members. Noted. Thank you so much.